We like to call it the Supernatural Hour. And now, our hosts.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Supernatural Hour. I'm your host, Castle. With us is Beaker.
What's happening?
We have Deanne. And we have Silent Dawn.
Hello.
So it'll just be the four of us. And tonight's episode should be hopefully interesting. Alright, so let's get on with our topic.
Which is Jack the Ripper. The story of Jack the Ripper is quite frightening and quite gruesome as well. So there might be some stuff that we talk about during this segment that might not be suitable for children. Yeah,
this actually, if you have kids listening, this might be a good time to end the episode. But if you're still here, if you can shoot the kids away, we'll continue. Which this time around is going to be Jack the Ripper. And you know what? Fascinating topic. I'm familiar with Jack the Ripper. I dug in a little bit deeper than I ever have before on some of the stuff I learned. And, you know, interestingly enough, it's a really mundane serial killer case. I mean, yeah, I can go to the library and find 101 serial killers, but some of the facts and just some of the unknowns about this case and some of there's just a special something about this case that makes it really fascinating.
Right. For me, if, you know, even though that we're talking about this topic today, if I were to answer our own poll, it would be Jack the Ripper. And for me, it's so fascinating and so creepy. One, because the time period. Two, it was so gruesome. And three, they have no idea who did it, which just adds kind of a mystery to it. And because of the mystery, it just kind of makes it bigger and bigger. I don't know. But I think this one is my favorite. I think it's fascinating.
I mean, the research I did, I mean, like you're right, they have no idea who Jack the Ripper actually was. And throughout the 100 and some odd years it's been since Jack the Ripper happened, there's been over 100 different suspects that they thought it possibly could have been, including one of them being the Queen's nephew, who supposedly impregnated somebody, and they were attempting to cover up the whole thing, and they were having anyone that knew about the pregnancy being killed.
Well, which to me is funny because that seems like one of the more far-fetched suspects. I'm going to talk about two that to me make the most sense, but I'll do that near the end of the segment. Let's kind of paint a picture for everybody of the time, the era, and the locale where this happened. Tim, tell us a little bit about White Castle, England.
So basically, where all this took place was on the east end of London, which is very poverty. Oh my God.
Poverty.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Poverty-stricken. Basically, it's the part of the town where like the immigrants went. There was a lot of Jewish immigrants that were escaping from Russia, but it was also just like where all the really poor people lived. There was apparently people were so poor that, like, you know, in order to just get a bed or a double bed in a common house cost like 8 pence. And just to get a single bed was like 4 pence, and a lot of people didn't even have money to do that. They said that there was some places where it was, I mean, so overcrowded and so poor that they had like ropes lined up, kind of like a line, like at Disneyland or whatever, and people were literally like lined up, standing up, sleeping, because that was like the only way that they could kind of get out of the environment and actually be inside where it was, you know, warm. Some people that did have money. They were so depressed because of, you know, the area and just the way things were where they lived. They would spend their money basically drinking all night. And so there was a lot of crime and violence that went on in this city because of just how poor the living conditions were, and which led to the part where, you know, there was really no work for women. And so a lot of women, in order to make money, turned to prostitution. And they said that at one point in time that there was over like 1,100 prostitutes just in this little area alone.
Yeah, in the White Castle district of London.
Yeah, I mean, it said it was full of brothels, opium dens, violence, disease, because there was no clean water. They said that you would hear people cry out murder all the time, and no one even would bat an eye because it happened all the time.
Yeah, and just really awful conditions. So the first murder that actually happened, happened, I believe it was August 31st of 1888. And the body was discovered at 3:40 in the morning. And that victim was Mary Ann Nichols, who was a 43-year-old woman.
That was the first confirmed murder.
Murder.
Of Jack the Ripper. There was actually 2 murders that happened earlier in that year. One in April. Some people credit Jack the Ripper for that one, but most historians will say what happened was this was one of the prostitutes that like owed some money to a gang or something, and she was actually beaten and violated by the gang and died from her injuries. And then there was another victim after that her name was, Martha Tabram, that they think might have been Jack the Ripper's first victim, but they're not 100% sure. The one that they do think that was the actual first victim is Mary Nichols.
Right. In fact, it's interesting because as you do the research, there's so, like as Tim mentioned earlier, there's so many murders in that area, so prolific with just crime and violence, that there are what are considered canon murders and non-canon murders. Non-canon murders being those that they're not sure, and the canon murders being those that they attribute to Jack the Ripper. And there's only 5 of those, and even those, there's some question as to whether all 5 of those are actually really his, but everybody seems to agree that they probably are. And I'm just going to name the victims real quick, and we'll kind of talk about where they were found and what state. But the first was Mary Ann Nichols, who died at 43 years old. Annie Chapman was the second. Elizabeth Stride at 44 years old. Did I mention Annie Chapman was 47?
Yes, I think you did.
I forget. Catherine Eddowes at 47. And then the last one was Mary Jane Kelly at age 25. And those are the 5 that they officially attribute to Jack the Ripper.
Well, and these all happened from starting on August 31st to November 9th in 1888. And one of the things that kind of caught people's attention on this is like the year prior, there'd only been like 6 deaths in this district. And people were kind of used to the deaths because it wasn't uncommon for basically a prostitute to be beaten and dying from those injuries. The thing that set these apart is, one, that they were so close together, but also the brutality of the murders.
Oh, yeah, these murders were heinous.
Right, and like with any serial killer, they have kind of their signature, and all 5 of these canonized ones, per se, had, the same method, as it were, and except for one, but the one, it's part of it fit the method, and they kind of figured that he got interrupted.
Right, and that one would actually be Elizabeth Stride, which they think is his, but we'll get into that in just a minute. Yep. So let's focus on Mary Ann Nichols first. Now, Mary Ann Nichols died at 43 years old. She's discovered on Friday, August 31st, 1888, at about 3:40 in the morning. Now, her throat had been cut with 2 cuts, very severe, all the way almost to the spine. The lower part of her abdomen was ripped open by a deep, jagged wound, and several other incisions of her abdomen were caused by the same knife. Now, if you investigate and research some of this is the one where the one suspect, his name is, last name is Crossed, or I have it written down here. Charles Lemire, he also went by Cross. He was actually found at this murder scene, but he wasn't ever officially investigated. And doing some of the research into it and some of the theories that people put forward, he actually makes a very compelling suspect, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But this is the first one that was discovered, was Mary Ann Nichols. She's often referred to as Polly Nichols. She was found on the side of the road by Charles Lemire and another gentleman. They went to go find a policeman, at which time her body was discovered by another policeman, and that's kind of when this all started. Now, the second victim we have is Annie Chapman. Tim, are you prepared to talk about Annie Chapman?
Sure.
Tell us about Annie Chapman.
Let's see. It says that was it September 8th in 1888. Her body was discovered in the backyard on 29 Hanbury Street, less than a mile away from Bucks Row, where the previous murder, Mary Nichols, had taken place. These were only a week apart. Let's see. She was identified as Annie Chapman, and at this time, violence had escalated, with the killer having removed and had taken her womb out of her body. So he didn't just slit her throat and disembowel her. He actually removed her womb.
Right, her entire abdomen was slashed open, and her uterus and womb were just completely gone. And this is kind of one of the hallmarks of Jack the Ripper that make him so interesting, because a lot of the suspects they were looking at, they started looking at doctors, butchers, people in mortuary work, because some of the surgical precision used
medical professionals and stuff like that.
Yeah,
too,
to remove some of these organs the way they're removed, they thought it had to be somebody who knew anatomy well enough to be able to remove those. Anybody who's ever gutted a trout or a deer or something like that, when you cut something like that open, there's just a big mass of guts in there, and you don't know really what's what. And to try and go in and remove specific parts without knowledge of anatomy, it's kind of a daunting task.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that, with the serial killers, they all usually have their signature, and that's one of the ways they kind of put these in the canonized ones, is they were missing body parts. It's as though he took them for a trophy. In some cases, he would take the heart.
And it's kind of interesting that you mentioned it as a trophy, and I didn't take a whole lot of notes on this part, but there were hundreds of letters sent to the police and the press, some on advice on how to catch the Ripper, some on who he possibly was, and some purporting to be the Ripper. There's 3 letters that they actually think may have been from Jack the Ripper. And
and before those letters were ever released, I mean, with the death of Annie Chapman, they did find a freshly washed leather apron near the body. And so at this time, again, because the identity was unknown and currently still is, they started referring to this particular killer as Leather Apron. And they actually did arrest a local man named John Pizer as the Leather Apron. He was the suspect, but due to the lack of evidence, he was kind of acquitted and released. And I believe he also helped investigate the death of Annie Chapman after that.
Yeah, there was a lot of suspects who were actually arrested and then later released for lack of evidence. So next up we have Elizabeth Stride. Oh, I forgot. I was going to mention the letters. In one of the letters that they think is authentic, he talked about basically eating half of one of the kidneys. In fact, they call that the Hill letter, where he said that he had eaten half of one of the kidneys, and they think that letter is authentic.
Quite possibly. The letters didn't come until after the 5 murders, though. That was later on.
Correct. So let's talk a little bit about Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Those 2 murders happened, they believe, within about 45 minutes of each other. And it looks like Elizabeth Stride, and that's one where experts have been kind of unsure whether or not she was a copycat murder or a second Ripper murder. The 2 theories on that is that the Ripper killed Elizabeth Stride, got interrupted because her body didn't have near the damage to it that other Ripper victims had. But then another body was found 45 minutes later, a few blocks away, that was definitely a Ripper victim. Let's talk about those just a little bit.
The first one, Elizabeth Stride, she was found at 1 a.m. by a gentleman named Louis Daimschutz. As he was turning down a dark alley, he found the body just laying there. And in this case, like you said, they think that he might have been interrupted because this particular woman's throat was slit, but there was no other signs of mutilation or anything like that. So they think that he was interrupted and he didn't get a chance to actually do what he normally did. And then, like you said, it was 45 minutes later at 1:45 a.m. that they found Catherine Eddowes.
Now, Catherine's throat was severed almost all the way to the spine. Her abdomen was also ripped open by a long, deep, jagged wound, and her left kidney and a major part of her uterus had been removed as well. Now, one thing to note with all these Ripper victims, and each killing got a little bit more and more brutal with the exception of Stride, who they think was either interrupted or it was a copycat murder. But he would carve onto the faces. There's little X's carved into the face. In one of the murders, and I don't recall which one it is, maybe you guys can help me out, he actually cut off the nose.
On the video I was watching earlier too, they mentioned that in one of the victims, it's not listed here in this in my notes, but I do remember them talking about one of the women that he disemboweled. He basically took her insides and strung it over her shoulder, and this dude was seriously messed up.
Yeah, in fact, I think that was Edo's that he'd done that with. Now, the next and last victim that they attributed to the Ripper was Mary Jane Kelly, and she was the youngest of the victims. She was 25 years old. And this one was hands down the most grotesque of all the Ripper murders that were out there. So Mary Jane Kelly was discovered in the room that she rented. The rent collector actually came and discovered her at 10:45 a.m. on Friday, November 1888. Excuse me. Her throat had been slit down to the spine. Her abdomen had been almost completely empty of all the organs. Her heart was missing completely, and all the muscle, meat, and skin were completely removed from her thighs. So she didn't have any. It was just down to the bone between the knees and her hip area. I believe her breasts were cut off. She was just completely mutilated.
One of the things that it said was with his murders, you could tell that there was just a complete disrespect for just the female gender in general, the way he did this.
Like he hated women altogether. For my notes here, it actually says that she was so horribly disfigured, the only way that they could identify her was her lover had been able to come down and identify her by her eyes and her ears. That was the only thing, I guess, that were left intact that they were able to use as positive ID, so they knew who the victim actually was.
Yeah, it was described that the room was completely covered in blood. Just a really grisly murder. In fact, as I was researching this topic, getting a little bit more in-depth information, I actually ran across an actual police photo of this particular murder.
I did too.
And granted, these photos were from 1888, so they're not as graphic as a photo taken today would be. But for an 1888 photo, it was pretty graphic. And
yeah, when I was looking up, they had photos of the victims, and most of them that shows their face and kind of the Victorian postmortem type pictures. But that one was very, very disturbing.
Now, what was fascinating is that after Mary Jane Kelly, the murders essentially stopped. There were 4 other murders that happened after that they thought might be the Ripper, but I think they later determined they were either different suspects or they didn't meet the MO. But the murders just suddenly stopped. So there's the 5 murders and then really nothing else that they could attribute to the Ripper. And this is kind of where the mystery happens, because why did they stop? Because most serial killers don't just stop. They either get incarcerated, committed to an insane asylum, they die either by suicide or get killed.
Well, unless you're maybe possibly doing some kind of ritualistic work that you believe you're doing, and once you've completed the ritual, then there's no point in continuing killing.
That's true. But there's also been theories that he could have immigrated. There's a lot of different theories as to why.
And I like I don't know that I like it, but I find the immigration one interesting because in doing the research, there was a photo on one of the pages that I was researching where, based on eyewitnesses, when I say eyewitnesses, people that had seen these women with other people, shortly before their death, and they actually came up with a photo based on all these descriptions, a composite photo of what they think that Jack the Ripper looks like, and he looks kind of Italian.
Now, here's where we get into interesting stuff. Suspects, and I'm sure that in your research, everybody here has heard about different suspects. There were some suspects at the time. There's some suspects that the press really liked. There's some suspects that police really liked. There's been suspects that have been kind of figured out in modern times. Even in the late 1900s, people were putting forth suspects that were later determined not to be legitimate suspects. I'm kind of curious to hear who all you think was the Ripper based on your research and why you think that person may have been the Ripper, if you have somebody.
I do. I actually have 2 things that kind of fit in with this. And the first was more a theory, And it kind of goes back to where it was such a poor area. And the more I researched it, the more I thought, maybe this is not, why it happened. But I do find it interesting.
You're going to say Santa Claus? Please don't ever say Santa Claus.
Oh,
Krampus.
Krampus?
Yeah.
Crap.
Did that ruin your theory?
No.
Okay.
But it was such a depressed area, and all the brothels and the opium dens, like we talked about before, that most of the elite society or even the middle class society was completely unaware of, because they didn't have, news, and you usually didn't wander around in these areas. And one of the theories was that someone did this just strictly to bring awareness to what was going on in this area for people who might be able to help do something about it.
Now there's some extreme activism for you right there.
Right. Anyway, I found that to be interesting, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I thought, that's an interesting theory. Now, as far as actually who, excuse me, and I didn't write his name down, but it was the man that they called Leather Apron, because they did say that they found some leather aprons, and he would hang around prostitutes and threaten them with a knife. And then he would say, and they would say if they didn't give him the money, he would rip them apart. And I know that Jack the Ripper ripped them apart. I don't know. But that one seemed, of the ones that I read, that one to me made the most sense. Because he hung out with the prostitutes. He wore a leather apron. He threatened them.
Well, what I find interesting with that one is they actually didn't know or didn't use the moniker Jack the Ripper until after the first 4 murders. Someone had actually mailed in a letter to the police, basically taking credit for the murders, and I believe it said in here, "You won't fix me yet," and that he basically gloated over all of the crimes that he committed and was bragging about what he had done, and he signed it Jack the Ripper. At this point, the police decided to release the letter to the press, which was a big mistake on their part. They found out later that the letter itself was actually a hoax, and it was written by a London journalist. But because the way the people were murdered and just the moniker itself, it caught on and became popular, and everyone just started calling him Jack the Ripper. And what's fascinating about this case, one of the things that I liked, was that this was the first international known serial killer. Like, it was so brutal that people here in the States were hearing about it, people all over the world were hearing about this dude, and he was the first internationally known serial killer, and at this time, from what I understand, is the most notorious serial killer of all time.
I'm going to talk about 5 different suspects, and I picked them because 2 of the 5 I think actually fit and could potentially be Jack the Ripper. 3 I picked because I just picked them, and 2 mostly because 2 of the 3 that I don't think are Jack the Rippers, because they're so ludicrous, but just gives you kind of an idea at the time of how freaked out people were, that they're grasping at straws. They were trying to find anything to explain what this was, and Dan, you've got to look.
I'm good.
Oh, you're looking around.
I'm hearing voices.
Okay. You're taking your lithium? All right.
No one else hears that? Okay.
No. So here's kind of who I have written down here, and I'm going to do it in order of ridiculous to who I think did it. So the first one I had was Sir John Williams, and Sir John Williams was a fertility doctor who was researching fertility, and the common prevailing theory in that day was that he had been driven insane because his wife was infertile, and he was trying to cure fertility so he could have children, and so he was killing these prostitutes to basically collect these organs to do experimentations and knowledge on to cure infertility, which I think in that day and age, with that kind of frenzied hubbub about the Jack the Ripper, that to them made perfect sense. I mean, today we look at that and go, that's kind of weak as far as a reason why someone would be out horrifically murdering people in this manner. The second one that I thought was kind of interesting and ludicrous, and the theories behind it were equally kind of ludicrous, was Duke of Clarence and Avondale. And the theory was that he was driven insane by syphilis, and because he captured syphilis from a prostitute, he was angry and crazy and was killing people. And the rumor back in the day was that because of this, the Queen had him committed to an asylum, and that there's basically a big Jack the Ripper cover-up because they were trying to. They thought that if it came out that royal was Jack the Ripper, that the citizenry would rise up and overthrow the monarchy.
So it's like Victorian fake news.
Yeah, it's like Victorian conspiracy theory, basically. Is that it's this Duke, and they're not telling us because if they tell us, then the whole British monarchy will crash down upon our heads. So that was one that I thought was kind of amusing, and it's just being ludicrous. One that I used to really like was Aaron Kosminski. He was a guy who was crazy. They thought they had found some DNA of his on Edo Shawl when they were investigating it several decades ago, when DNA evidence became a thing. But they later debunked it. They claimed that he bragged about the murders while he was in an asylum. But essentially Kosminski was later disproven to be a Jack the Ripper suspect. Now, the two that I think actually stand a chance and make a lot of sense, and I saw two amazing documentaries about these two individuals. The first one is Charles Lechmere, or Charles Cross. He was actually found with the first victim. He was found there by his neighbor, and the neighbor got there just a few minutes after Charles Lemire got there, and Charles claimed that he found the body, so him and the neighbor went to go find a policeman. When they found the policeman, Lemire told the policeman that there was a policeman there waiting with the body, which they couldn't have known that because they'd left the area. But when the policeman got there, there was a policeman who had found the body. As you go back and look at Charles Lemire, all the bodies were found on the two routes that he walked to and from work. And he worked as a butcher's delivery guy. He actually would deliver meat all along that district. But he would leave for work about 3 a.m., had a 40-minute walk to work, and then would walk back, and there's two fast routes, and all the bodies were found along those routes, except for two of the bodies, which were found between his house and his mother's house. There were some different discrepancies between when these murders started and when he had a falling out with his mother. And his background, when you look into it, matches up with what we know about modern serial killers. He had kind of a disrupted, harsh childhood, moved around a lot. The long and short of it is that the time of the murders and the location of the murders match up with where he was at all the time. And there are several statements he made that were contradicted by the evidence when you actually go through and look at it. The police at the time never really investigated him. But modern ripperologists, and there is such a thing as ripperologists,
Yes, there is.
Have gone back and looked at this. They've actually had a barrister, which is an attorney, kind of a high-ranking attorney, look at the evidence that they compiled against this Charles Lemire, and he said that, yeah, there's a really strong circumstantial case that you could put in front of a jury based on the evidence about Charles Lemire. Now, the second one, that the problem with Lemire, the Lemire theory that I don't really care for, is the fact that the murders just suddenly stopped. Lemire lived to be into his 70s, and generally what we know about most serial killers is they don't just stop. They usually stop because they get locked up or killed or whatever. It's not really common for a serial killer to stop. And he lived into his 70s, so after those murders, there really wasn't anything else they could attribute to him. The second suspect, and this is the one that I like a lot, his name is Charles Ferdinand Feigenbaum, and he was executed on 1896 on April 27th, and he was executed in Sing Sing, New York, at that penitentiary. And Feigenbaum immigrated to the United States just after the Ripper murders stopped, and got caught in a similar murder here in New York. I say here in New York because New York is right here next to Utah.
Yes.
But in New York...
This far away on a map.
Yeah, people can't see your fingers, Tim.
Sure they can. Use your imaginations.
Theater of the mind. He got caught actually leaving the scene of a murder that bore striking resemblance to the Ripper murders. So he was captured, tried, convicted. After he's convicted, he told his attorney that he hates women, wants to attack women, and basically gave a really credible confession, if you will, without out and out saying, "I'm Jack the Ripper," that he did that. Now, the researcher who looked into Feigenbaum's past found that he worked for a shipping company out of Germany who had several other murders there that were Ripper-esque in how they were done. Now, the shipping company that Feigenbaum worked for frequently had ships sailing to port near the White Castle district at the time that the Ripper murders happened. The researcher who looked into Feigenbaum actually went to the shipping company, which still exists, and looked into the records from that era. And all the records, it shows Feigenbaum working on their ships and docking in the White Castle area. However, all the documents from the fall of 1888 are missing.
Interesting.
Yeah, all those documents are missing. Everything else is there. They know the ships he worked on. They know when he docked. But those records are not there, which is kind of suspicious in and of itself. And again, those murders stopped when Feigenbaum immigrated to the United States. So those two are the most compelling suspects in my mind.
I vote for Feigenbaum.
I kind of vote for Feigenbaum too. But what's your thoughts, Tim?
I still think it was some ritualistic work that someone was doing. I have no idea. I would probably go with the dude that was caught in New York as well. I mean, there's just so many coincidences. I mean, the fact that he was caught pretty much red-handed killing a woman in New York in a very similar manner to those in London not that long after the murders in London stopped. It's to me very possible that was the actual Jack the Ripper. But it's one of the things we might never know.
Yeah, I'm going to say, Lechmere makes there's a compelling case for Lechmere, except for I just can't explain why the murders just stopped with Lechmere.
Right, that's why I like Feigenbaum
That's the only thing
better.
I can think is like if it was some kind of satanic ritual that he was conducting.
And, maybe he's one of those serial killers that he reached a certain point and is like, okay, I've got what I need and I'm done.
Which is very rare.
But yeah, you don't hear about that very
I was
often.
going to say, but yeah, that's usually not the case. Anyway, hopefully we've creeped everybody out to a significant extent.
Which do you want to talk about the letter from hell?
Yeah, do you have the text for that?
I got it right here. So, like I mentioned earlier about the letter where they gave the moniker Jack the Ripper to him, there was a lot of hoax letters that went out afterwards. People claiming to be Jack the Ripper or giving out, false evidence or confessions. There was one particular letter that was sent to a George Lusk, who was the president of the Mile End Vigilance Committee. This was sent in mid-October of 1888. This letter was addressed from hell. And in this letter, there was wrapped up in the box, there was a kidney that he claims that he had taken from one of the victims.
If I remember right, they checked that kidney, and I think they did determine it was human, if I remember correctly.
Yes, they did. And so what they think that letter was also a hoax that was done by one of the medical students nearby, that he had taken it basically from a cadaver and mailed it in. But still, that's creepy as heck to, you get a letter that's, here's a kidney. I took it from my victim.
Well, it's interesting you say that about the hoax, because there was I know the authorities at the time were frustrated because they thought there might have been a lot of copycat murders going on at the same time, which they thought were basically, and I love the way they used to think and talk in those days, where weak-minded individuals were, that's a direct quote, weak-minded individuals were carrying out copycat crimes, which is what they attributed some of the non-Ripper murders to, as basically copycat killers, but because the murders didn't have the similarities as the Ripper murders with the disfigurations, basically wrote those off as copycats.
Well, and doing the investigation must have been extremely difficult to begin with, being that this is at a time where forensics weren't really around yet.
Right.
So you're not able to use the current techniques that we have now when you're trying to solve a murder. So that just makes it even more difficult on top of, what's already going on. And I did read at one point they basically tried to keep the press out of the investigations originally, and the press got frustrated that they were being shut out, so the press started kind of making up their own stuff, which kind of hurt the investigation.
They do have Victorian fake news.
What the thing that astounds me is, these type of cases would be solved fairly easily these days with the forensics we have, DNA and things of that nature. But in these days, they didn't have the technology we have as far as even just communication and stuff. As I've researched this and seen the records they have, like Feigenbaum's records on what ship he were sailing on and what dates they were docked in White Castle, I'm thinking these records from 1888 are meticulous, and they're like paper records, and they're still around that people can go check on these records. Same thing with Lechmere. There's records on where he lived. I mean, you can see all the childhood homes he was in based on the record keeping they had, which to me is astounding for that day and age, that they can track people that closely and still have those old hard copy records squirreled away that people can go look and read. I mean, the fact that just the records on Feigenbaum from just that time period are missing from that shipping company is astounding, because I look at it and think, could you go back to a shipping company from 1970 and still find records? I don't know if you could or not. I mean, you probably could, but just it's not like it is nowadays where it's all in the cloud. The best way to support us is basically come visit us at the ghost hunts. If you're looking for merchandise or if you want branded stuff, we've got hats, we've got stickers, that stuff to you. That's the best way to support us. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Peace out, butterflies.
You've been listening to the Supernatural Hour at AdvancedParanormal.com. The Supernatural Hour is part of the Radio Ronin network, found at RadioRonin.com. Copyright by Advanced Paranormal Services.